Today we're going to look at the early Industrial Revolution and how they went from making things by hand to making things by machines. The invention that would change everything and revolutionize society was the steam engine, which was invented by James Watt in 1765. Steam power would be the power source of the 1800s, much like electricity and gasoline were the power sources of the 1900s. The early textile industry was started in Great Britain. It was called the Arkwright system, and they were large machines and factories that produced thread. They take it from the plant-based material and they made thread out of it, and it brought down the cost of making cloth, which people had to do on their own. Now, Britain was so protective of this system, which they had around the world, that they tried to keep it a secret. They made it a law that you could not leave the country if you knew about this system. But people did somehow. A man named Moses Brown in Rhode Island put out a reward for anybody who could bring the Arkwright system to America. And Samuel Slater, who was a British industrialist, but he was a middle manager, he was never going to make it all the way to the top. And so what he did was he memorized the system, and then he snuck out of the country dressed as a woman. So he went onto a ship dressed as an old woman, and by the time the ship was away from shore, he dressed back into his gentleman's clothes, and he came off and he built the first textile mills in the United States in 1793. That same year, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney. And what it did was it was able to take the seeds out of cotton very quickly and in large volumes, so that slaves didn't have to be doing it all day just to get a little bit out. So by making this invention, it made it possible to grow huge fields, huge plantations of cotton, which had now a ready market in the north with Slater's mill and also over in Great Britain, and cotton would become the biggest volume export of the United States. Another idea of Eli Whitney was ahead of its time. It was called interchangeable parts. The idea was every part on a product, if it broke, it could be easily replaced with another part. Now, Eli Whitney had made this contract with the U.S. government to supply them with muskets, and he promised that every part of the musket could be replaced with another part. The problem for Eli Whitney was the machines that could make such precise measurements had not been invented yet. So it took him years and years before he finally fulfilled his contract with the muskets, but they weren't interchangeable. The first person to actually produce something with interchangeable parts was a guy named Samuel Colt, who made his famous revolver with interchangeable parts. As they say about Samuel Colt, God made all men different, but Colt made them equal. That's because everybody could shoot a gun. Now, interchangeable parts are one reason why we have so much stuff, because we can buy things at very low prices. If you had to replace a light bulb by having somebody make a brand new light bulb for you by hand, it would cost $100. Nobody'd be able to afford light bulbs but very rich people. But we just go down to the store, we buy a light bulb, it fits in, they have a standardized socket in there, and everything fits. And so because of that, with cars and everything else, which have interchangeable parts, we are able to afford so much stuff that we wouldn't be able to afford otherwise. As I mentioned, machine tools would have to be made to make it possible to have interchangeable parts, and here's a machine shop that makes some of these kind of parts. Another big part of the Industrial Revolution is called division of labor, because if you want to make things in mass amounts and huge amounts so that all kinds of people can buy them and they can be made at very low cost, you have to have division of labor. And that means everybody in your factory is doing a separate job. They do that same job all day long, and so it moves just from, like in later times, from a conveyor belt from one place to another place to another place, and then it's done. Before this, you'd have craftsmen and artisans who would make the entire product from beginning to end, but it costs a lot more money to do that. And so division of labor is essential in order to make the Industrial Revolution work. A major factor that spurred the American Industrial Revolution, which came after Great Britain and France and some others, was the fact of the War of 1812. The United States was cut off from all of our trading partners. Therefore, to get the goods that people wanted, factories would have to be made in America, and we have to make our own stuff. And so, because of this war, Americans began to realize we shouldn't rely too much on Europe for manufactured goods. And so that starts Industrial Revolution in the United States. Going back to the textile mills, when Samuel Slater got here, what his idea was, it was called the Rhode Island system, was to hire families to work in his factories. Both the father, the mother, and the children were used in the factories. The children were able to reach in to small places so that they could get things unstuck. So everybody worked. It worked out pretty well because the kids were not going to disappoint their parents. They knew their parents were supervising them, and everybody's working for the entire family so that everybody can make it. They're all working so that their entire family can make a living. And so it worked for a while, but it could be dangerous also. Francis Lowell also started some textile mills up in the north, and his idea was to hire young unmarried women from farms, nearby farms in the area, to work in the factories. They would work a couple of years until they got married. Lowell treated them well. They would take them to plays. They would have etiquette classes for them. They didn't know how to read and write. They learned how to read and write. Plus, they had money on their own for the first time. So for women on the farms, this was a big opportunity. The work was very hard. It was very tedious work, very hard. The air was not that good for breathing. This is why, and the noise was really loud. So this is why they wanted them out within a couple of years and married off, because it just really wasn't that great for your health. But women were earning money, and they were getting to go to plays. They were getting to see friends on the farm. It's kind of lonely. You're miles away. You might see people on Sunday if you had a church nearby, but for the most part you didn't. So this worked out quite well in those early years. But once Francis Lowell and other of these early industrialists began to die off, new people came in, plus you also had an influx of immigration in the mid-1800s. And with that, you had all kinds of people, women coming in who wanted jobs, and when you have a high supply and a lower demand, so you're going to have low prices. And so the wages went down, and the working conditions worsened, and this became much more of a drudgery type thing than it was before. And it could be very dangerous. If you're working long hours and you're not attentive, you could lose a hand, you could lose an arm, you could be killed by these machines that were going very, very fast. They had quotas for you. You had to make a certain amount of thread or cloth each day. So in those later years, it became a much, much more harsh kind of work than it was in the past. In the textile mills, just like in other manufacturing plants, as the conditions went down and the wages went down, workers began to organize and make unions or trade unions to try to get fair pay or fair treatment. And one of the first ones for women was the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. It was founded by Sarah Bagley, and they had some strikes. They didn't always win, but they did get some better conditions.